Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you here today. And I want to really appreciate and welcome Jamie Joyce for coming and joining us today. I first met Jamie in October when her organization, Society Library, actually was a fantastic organizational partner to the Metagov research area on interoperable deliberative tooling. And we were so lucky at that time that Jamie could actually come and participate with her wisdom and her advanced technology to share what she's doing in the deliberation and collective intelligence space. I invited Jamie to come present her expansive work here to Metagov because I wanted to learn more about Society Library. I want to learn more about the trajectory of how this work has developed among Jamie and collaborators. And I've also, you know, caught glimpses into other parts of the ecosystem that Jamie moves in. Something called Society Library Coin happened. There's also some AI avatars representing like different kind of wisdom that operate. Anyways, always something very interesting emerging from Jamie Joyce's corner of the universe. So I'm just super happy to welcome Jamie in today. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. And over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I really appreciate you reaching out and extending the opportunity for me to present because Metagov is obviously a wonderful community, and I would say it's our community in a way, even though the Society Library kind of dips in and out because we are very much in our own trajectory, as Liz mentioned. So we're always kind of like in and out. So it's really nice to kind of dive in a little bit more deeply. And one thing I will say is how I prepared this talk was that I presume that so many of you are also in this space generally in technology, deliberation tech, LLMs. So I assume a level of familiarity with technology. So my plan for today was just to kind of give you a showcase of the kinds of things that the Society Library works on. And then maybe it could be more of a dialogue. Questions could be asked, and I can double click and go into specific directions in terms of what we're building next and how that's going and pull up examples and things like that. But first, I just want to start by giving a little bit more of a background about me. So I've actually been working in this space of trying to scale deliberation. And by deliberation, what we mean is not mediation between different groups of people, but actually formalizing logical argumentation to try to find optimal solutions to really complex socio-political issues. And this is a technique that actually came from Benjamin Franklin. So the Society Library's full legal name is actually the Benjamin Franklin Society Library, because when I read his autobiography many, many years ago, he described this deliberation process where intelligent individuals come together and they, in a formatted way, share their arguments about some sort of complex socio-political issue, and they're able to deliberate very specifically to find solutions to those issues. And when I read this, I thought, oh, you can scale this with technology. And instead of trying to get a number of people in the room, which is a bandwidth constraint, you can instead extract arguments, claims, and evidence from where people are expressing themselves. So the Society Library is a little bit, different as compared to like citizen assembly-based projects or projects that try to get people on a platform, because what we are presuming is that somewhere in the world, someone is probably already making this argument in a book, on a podcast, on social media, in a blog post, in a documentary, something. So we go and collect that information and then we model it as a deliberation. And I will show you what that looks like. But there's so many pieces to this, which is, of course, making sure that we have access to data. So another circle you may see me running around in is the data and archive space. I helped the Internet Archive kick off their Democracy's Library program, which is to collect as many documents, data sets, research records, publications, microfilm, microfiche, and web HTML from the government as possible. I still work with the Internet Archive, and I just came back from a 3-month tour in DC, working on what I call preventing data waste. So, really made some progress with the National Archives there. So I exist in many little worlds, but let's get started into actually exploring some of the technology. So let me share my screen if I may. And definitely don't want to show you my entire and And let's start here. Okay. Can everyone see this cute little graph?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So there's a quote that was offered to me, which I really love in my time in DC. And it goes something like this: for simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. But simplicity on the other side of complexity, I would give you anything I have. And I feel that so deeply as a part of the Society Library, because this graph here is just a small little snippet of one little argument. And I'll dive into it in just a second. One little argument in one localized policy issue. And what I'm hoping to show you just now is just how complex it really is to try and debate, deliberate, and find logically optimal solutions to socio-political issues, especially not only when you're trying to reconcile facts of the matter, which are highly debatable, but also trying to accommodate the fact that we have ideologically opposing values and preferences and ethics. So let's talk about simplicity and complexity. So in 2022, we made our very last handmade map. So we manually created a map related to the last remaining nuclear power plant in California, which is Diablo Canyon. And we modeled 5,862 points across 9 different points of view. And these points included economic, environmental, safety, political, ethical, all these different considerations. And then we fact-checked and steel-manned as much as possible. And here's a little snippet. So on the topic of nuclear power plants, we have this question of what should happen to this last remaining nuclear power plant in California called Diablo Canyon. Again, this is just a snippet. So I pulled out this one position. And this one position is, in general, the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant's license should be extended and the power plant should be left to operate past its decommissioning date, for example, another 5, 10 to 20 years. So this was a general position that many people took on this real debate topic in California. But there are 8 others. Of the many categories, which I just referenced, environmental and economic or whatever, we have one little safety category. In the category of safety, I pulled out this one little argument. Now, let's just zoom in on this node right here. It says some laypersons may want Diablo Canyon to close because they fear nuclear radiation in general, especially because of the perceived health risks. However, actual nuclear radiation is misunderstood and both disproportionately and irrationally feared by non-expert laypersons. In actuality, radiation poses minimal risk from a plant operating normally and safely, which Diablo Canyon is. So we should not let this fear and misunderstanding from laypersons determine if the plant should close at a scheduled decommissioning date. Now, a lot of people don't write this way, right? It's a pretty complete statement. Or that could be a paragraph that could be found in a document somewhere. This is a steel-manned argument. But in order for this argument that's being made to be sound, which means provably true, given that the logic is valid, you have to extricate out all of the premises. And the reason why I plucked out this data sample is because it's actually really difficult to prove something like this is true. And anyone can feel free to stop me if you're losing me. I'm assuming there's a level of familiarity with like logical reasoning and argumentation in a informal, formal sense, which is oftentimes a lot of people do not speak nor write. And it's why the Society Library kind of takes a different approach than so many other deliberation systems, is because logical reasoning and formal debate has been a tool for the sincere inquiry into truth and rightness for millennia. And so we're really trying to harness that and use that and bring it to the deliberative space, even though most people are like speaking in enthymemes and all these different rhetorical strategies where they don't know that they're leapfrogging logical validity. So if we're extricating out and breaking down what this argument is, the claims in this argument that would need to be true include some laypersons may want Diablo Canyon to close because they fear nuclear radiation in general. Okay. And as you can see for our specific graph structure, you can see the claims, you can see the links as to where these are coming from, references where people are making this assertion. So essentially we're grounding it. We're grounding it and we're saying some people have made this particular claim. The next premise is nuclear radiation is feared in part because of its perceived level of health risks to humans. So you're going to have to not only prove that nuclear radiation is feared, but more specifically the subset because of its perceived health risks. And then you have to argue over the veracity of, but the true health risk of radiation exposure from a normal and safe operating nuclear energy production is misunderstood by non-expert laypersons. And then you have to prove non-expert laymen also disproportionately and irrationally fear the potential health risk of nuclear radiation exposure. The actual radiation from nuclear energy production when operating normally and safely poses minimal risks, and Diablo Canyon is operating normally and safely. Therefore, we should not let fear, blah, blah, blah. So something that is hard, I think it's hard for some people to grok when it comes to the Society Library is that this seems like overkill. But something that we've experienced just by examining so many debates on the internet is that they can go on and on and on and on because we're not actually taking the time to deconstruct what is actually being argued about, or even like identifying the meaning of certain terms. What do we mean by like actual risk when it comes to nuclear radiation? So this is just one little tiny data sample of an enormous 5,000 point graph. So what does it look like to argue about this? You can see there's numbers on the side here. So we mapped this argument trying to prove it as true or not true. So this is the same argument, but deconstructed. And so this is what it looks like for each one of this is one of those little premises in the argument. And these are all the nodes that are arguing back and forth whether or not it's true. So in terms of harnessing our collective intelligence, it's about finding the pro and con arguments, claims, and evidence to support the premises and arguments that people are making to support or refute specific positions. But this again is just one argument of so many arguments. This right here is a video, 2x speed of us just scrolling through only 3 layers unpacked of the Diablo Canyon graph. This will go on for a minute. Yeah.
I think maybe you shared only your window, so we're not seeing the scrolling or the video.
Oh no. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. So let me go
Now
back.
we see it.
So this is not the video. This is just that one argument. So switching back, this one little argument here that I just walked through and it seemed like there was so much content in it. This is that argument steelmanned. So that means we collected arguments and claims and evidence from scholarly articles, government documents, other sources of media like blog posts and textbooks and documentaries. This is what it actually looks like to harness the collective intelligence arguing over the truth and relevance of the premises in that specific argument. So again, that one little argument I showed you, this is what it looks like to argue about it. And this is, deduplicated materials. This isn't just regular stuff scraped from the web. This is stuff that is grounded. You can see I'm clicking on like quotes. It's actually coming from someplace. But as I was saying before, we can start this over. The entire graph, when we're debating about Diablo Canyon, is enormous. We actually cannot open the graph in its entirety because it's so big. So this is just 3 layers unpacked. This video will go on for 1 minute and 50 seconds. And again, this is not just scraped stuff from the web that you can just visualize. This is stuff that we manually curated, that is logically coherent, that is fact-checked, grounded, quoted, steelmanned as much as possible, labeled, linked, described as much as possible. And this will just go on and on. And so the North Star of the Society Library is, can we have formal debate? This ancient technique that humans have been using to try and figure out what is right and optimal and true for literally thousands of years. Can we take that and apply that not only to the collective knowledge that a given civilization is generating, but also the preferences and values that people are expressing online about how they want their civilization to run? But what is the point of creating these structured data sets? Well, as a library, we just want to create these structured data sets to provide knowledge, to inquire into truth, and to essentially enable an intellectual capability that has never before been possible, which is the civilization scale understanding and the ability to understand what are the main points of view of a given issue and dive into the really technical argumentation about whether or not something is true, which is really important if you do the work, because you will realize that you can't just really cherry pick facts from what one person may assume is a veritable source, because once you really start going down the rabbit hole, you realize that knowledge production in and of itself, especially over the past 20th century, is highly politicized. There's arguments about different standards and different methods for how we went about collecting and observing different types of knowledge that bubble up and are in aggregate super relevant to our interpretation of claims that are really important to political debates today. But we don't just make these graphs. We create all sorts of knowledge products that are visualizations. So that that video where you saw of all these things, this is an interactive briefing document. That is a visualization of that exact same data. We can also structure that data into our decision-making models. This is a digital decision-making model that we have. This one is for AI consciousness, but essentially our knowledge graphs link directly into these things as well. We also have entity visualizations. It's really easy to make, whizzy things, and you can say, oh, let's explore this and the relationships between them. We have a number of different out-of-the-box tools, including position prediction. We have fact-checking APIs. We've got all sorts of search and retrieval APIs that are modularized that we use. We've even created computationally constructed legislation in coordination with the senator. Oh, I'm forgetting to click the button again. So this was, the visualizations, whizzy visualizations that you can make of like entities just for fun. Again, position predictors. And here's the legislation. Sorry if I left you all behind in the visualizations. I apologize for that. And so there's a number of different ways in which the structured data can be useful. And there's a number of ways in which the tools that we are using to now automate everything that we're working on, because we're now working on just a one-button solution. We want to get to these grounded civilization scale knowledge graphs that can port into all these different interfaces, as well as be given to partners. And so we're just working on a completely integrated system. You ask a policy question, you press a button, it cascades out our AI agents, our search and retrieval mechanisms, analysis to logically label. We've been working on a fine-tuned model to understand the ontology that we've been able to derive from analyzing so many civilization scale debates and organize knowledge into that logical format. So basically like everything that we used to do manually, including, collecting descriptions, grounding claims in quotes, defining definitions, finding media and explanatory media, all these little tiny like metadata even tasks we're creating components and tooling for, so that all together humanity can have this new type of, at the press of a button library service where they can understand what are the different points of view on this complex socio-political issue, and what are the arguments, claims, and evidence that support why one position may be more optimal, one position may be more right or true. And then also all of the lovely layers on top of actually generating legislation, actually enabling people to make decisions based on the structured knowledge, being able to read it in different forms like the paper, and also being able to experience it in different ways. Like one of the things, Liz asked me to potentially talk about today was the SL token, which we did not launch. It happened to us, where the crypto community launched a meme token in our name. And so we decided to embrace it, and we created AI agents before Grok 3 came out. We actually presented to the XAI team some of our strategies, and it sounds like Grok 3 may have taken some lessons from the Society Library inquiry into truth methods, which is really a great honor. But also before Grok 3 came out and became like an AI agent where people can tag tweets and say, is this true? We had released our own Muse of Truth, where you could also tag her in a tweet and she would fact check it for you. And we've killed the project because, Grok 3 is obviously now the de facto tool people use on X. We're not going to compete with Grok on its own platform. But you can still go to her Twitter account and see how she performed fact checks. She was multilingual, and she was also an epistemological tool. So she not only said, first of all, she would never say this is true or not true. She would say, I found evidence to support, or I found evidence to refute, or I didn't find evidence, things like that. She would summarize it, extract quotes, and have references from the materials that she analyzed. But she was also epistemological in that she would point out the primary sources that would need to exist in order for her to actually come to a definitive conclusion. So she was an educational tool. And I think that that's basically like where we're at. We're just, nose to the grindstone, working on automating everything, creating cute little tools along the way, like the Muse of Truth. And I think I'll stop there. And maybe if y'all have very specific questions, then we can dive into that. And thanks so much for your time and letting me, speed run this update. Go ahead, Steve. I don't know if I can unmute you. I don't know if I'm a host.
Nah, I managed to unmute myself. So, and this is all great. It just seems to me that the best application is at a lower level, at the level of an epistemic core, that we should really be using this within science itself. So not just, you know, consulting primary sources, but actually debating those primary sources, having those primary sources
Mhm.
debate each other. That's what we really need, because then everything else will be much more coherent to build any further argument structure on top of if you have a,
We do
coherent
that.
underlying structure. So I'm surprised you're not talking more about that use case of, open science.
Yeah. So I have a slide somewhere, and I when I looked at the attendees, I saw many familiar names, so I was like, oh, a lot of these people know my work already. But there's a slide I have of like all of the use cases, and yes, like scientific field mapping, scientific deliberation, policy making. There's so many different use cases. Scenario prediction, forecasting. There's so many different use cases, and I love that you bring up like those like little kernel of debates, because those are my favorite. Like when you're debating whether or not SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus, you have to both go in the direction of arguing over, well, who creates the naming conventions for these things anyway? And like there's actually a board of people who decide the name of viruses, right? And then they do it based on criterion. So some of that criterion is like the little, crown shape, right? So okay, now you have to go look at electron microscopy and like how like find the images of like coronavirus that have like the electron microscopy photos, put those like actual images in the graph, which I don't think I did a good job of explaining the multimedia aspect of what our nodes can accommodate. They can even accommodate mathematical structures. But then we get into the debate about, well, how often, like how reliable is human interpretation of electron microscopy in the past, and finding debates within scholarly papers of like scientists getting it wrong when they're looking at these micrographs. So like it's really fun to go that deep. Society Library intends to go that deep because, like you said, Steve, it's like getting clarity at the bottom. It's like everything aggregates up, right? And so if you aren't penetrating down that depth, you are like potentially like just building your arguments on a pile of like incorrect premises, which it's also funny, like the Society Library has, I think, a kind of Socratic existence. Like we're not squarely in any given community, but we're in and out of a lot. And when I mentioned that like some people think of us as overkill, it reminds me of how Socrates was so persnickety and annoying about his inquiry into truth. He was sentenced to death by Athenian vote. It was it was democracy that killed Socrates, right? In the legend, the father of Western philosophy, dedicated to inquiry into truth, pioneered the Socratic method, which is the most rigorous inquiry into truth. But it was so annoying to democracy itself. Democracy killed him. So I feel like in the deliberative democracy space, Society Library is also kind of like that. It's like we're the persnickety ones. But we do go down to that level of depth. And I think we need to, but a lot of folks are just like, nah, let's not do that. It's too much.
So you're going to share that use case slide then with me, right?
I can do that. I can look it up. But maybe someone can ask a question while I am looking up this slide.
And it looks like you got a couple of questions or yeah.
Sorry, I did not hear you.
I was just gonna say, Anne, it looks like Anne has a couple of questions in the chat. And then Lee, if you have a question.
I'll ask my most provocative question first, based on what Steve said, and that's that is this a strict dependency graph, in the sense that you get a fact about the shape of the virus wrong, and then you are always incorrect at the higher level? Or can incorrect facts essentially get overwhelmed by additional information or canceled out at higher levels?
That's a great question. So it's not a dependency graph because there's no like embedded calculation related to them. So debate map itself, which is the tool, can and does have ways of like adding weight to the value of nodes, but the Society Library has like killed that functionality, nor are we engaging in it until we have enough examples of what we would consider meaningfully complete civilization scale deliberations. Because like we feel like any type of calculation is going to be arbitrary. And it's again, it's when it comes to arguing over truth, unfortunately, some aspect of it is rather subjective, because when you're talking about policy issues, you're also talking about ethics and preferences and values, to which like people can certainly argue about like rightness, right? Like that's like the whole history of philosophy and like morality and things like this. But yeah, we're not even going to dive into calculation, Bayesian, or like any other
Right.
way of trying to model like value until we have enough examples of diverse sets, right? Like a highly technical like set of civilization scale arguments, and then like highly like, you know, in the space of morality and preferences and values, like only then do we think it is appropriate to even start imagining how to weight it. And that's why, you know, some people asked us to make a decision-making model, because it's like we've been holding off. And then a city council came to us and they're like, well, we want to make a decision. We want to add values to this. So we invented our decision-making model, which is a micro voting decision-making model. It actually forces people to vote on the arguments that support a proposition as opposed to the proposition themselves. And what we found is that people actually make different decisions when they vote on the propositions as opposed, or the arguments as opposed to the propositions. Yeah. So no, maybe one day, and don't even want to think about it until we have enough data to do research into what would be optimal. And I think what ultimately the Society Library's role is will just be providing the data, and then people can come up with all sorts of ways in which they want to weight or vote or calculate on top of and process, and then they can argue, and maybe we can map their arguments as to why their way of weighting is the best.
Well, I'm interested in when priors become defined, actually. So when you go from some Jeffersonian completely undefined prior, could be anything, to a structured prior that gives you some direction on what you don't know, as well as what you do know. So I think you maybe are not quite at the structured prior, but getting there. And if you thought about it that way, you might think about where you need to look also for additional impactful decision examples.
Decision examples. Can you provide an example of that?
Yeah, so cases where you make the right decision, even given inadequate information, will help you constrain your priors.
Cool. Well, Anne, I hope one day maybe you will be of service in creating means by which our data can be useful to making optimal decisions.
Then my other question also kind of relates to that. Is this all drawn from English language or translated?
For now, yeah. I mean, it's not our ideal, right? And sadly, we have constraints. It's not our ideal, but right now we do English speaking, kind of like Western complex socio-political issues. So
I can imagine that it would be very difficult to even frame some of these questions in Sanskrit.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I'm not going to pretend that Western logic is going to apply in the same way. You know what I mean? I want to really respect other epistemologies. So we also, like, even though we use language, like we want to be maximalist and all this context and all this stuff, we are still in a very small bubble. Because yeah, like I am not fluent in all languages, all modalities of knowing and epistemologies. So what the Society Library is offering is like, of all the intellectual capabilities that can be expanded upon with technology, all the different collective intelligence capabilities that can be new in the 21st century, what we're offering is we're taking, you know, the Western informal logical reasoning that has been, again, used for millennia about political issues. And it's like, we're focused on these socio-political deliberations at the civilization scale, using a formalized informal logical reasoning, specifically so that people can make free and informed choices about these complex issues. So it's very, very niche.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hey, good to see you again.
Hey, I guess you're talking to me. Hey, Jamie, good to see you too. So I just thought I'd mention quickly, specifically to respond to Anne, I've been working on the problem of actual decision-making models and decision-making based on top of structured debates. And as Jamie says, there will always be an element of subjectivity, not just because people have different values and beliefs, but because even when evaluating facts, people will react to evidence in different ways. To some people, some evidence will be more convincing than others. But I'm working on a model. And so another thing that Jamie mentioned, which I think is key to a decision-making model, is to recognize that people do vote differently when they're voting on arguments versus when they're just voting on a claim. And that is because it engages a different part of their brain. They think differently about the claim after they see the arguments. The arguments might actually convince them. And so the idea of what I'm working on with social protocols and the global brain algorithm is to try to make a decision-making model that is, while subjective, tries to simulate an informed opinion. So it says, okay, well, what if everybody, a lot of people might vote and think this fact is true based on their first impression, but after reading all the arguments, what would they think? The problem is no one can read the entire argument back. It would probably take months to read through Diablo Canyon and to really understand it. And so what we're working on is a protocol that tries to identify a critical set of arguments that provides the information that people might not already have or might change people's minds in order to simulate what people might believe if they had all the information. So I just wanted to throw that in there since it's relevant.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. And, it's great to be in this community. I got involved in this space, I think over 8 years ago. I was one of the co-founders of Canonical Debate Lab.
I think Jamie just froze.
Yeah, same for me.
Like Democracy Earth, and a lot of folks were talking about liquid democracy. Hang on one sec. Unstable network connection. Am I back now? Okay, sorry. I live in a lovely old building and there's construction happening all the time. What's the last thing I said? I co-founded Canonical Debate Labs. Back then, a lot of folks were focused on digital democracy, and we felt like the deliberation piece and like making sure that voters had the information that they needed, as opposed to just like allocating their votes elsewhere, which was the hot thing back then, was something that existed. And it's really nice to now see, almost a decade later, people really hyper-focused on like, how do we enable people to engage meaningfully in argumentation, and how do we scale deliberation and things like that. One thing also I want to say is that the Diablo Canyon map, which again is the last manually created map, we now already at the push of a button, we generate graphs and ground them. I didn't show an example of that, but we've already made progress in the one button solution. So we've created fine-tuned models that predict the possible span of positions, the categorical, like the fields and categories that be relevant to positions, the arguments, counter arguments, examples. So that's already a push of a button, and then we actually ground and prune automatically. So we're already able to generate graphs that are bigger than Diablo Canyon at the press of a button. Now we're just getting more into the logical rigor part of it. But Diablo Canyon took about 8,000 human research hours. And so getting back to your point about like humans can't read it all, it's like something that also I think distinguishes a society library a little bit in terms of philosophy in the space is that one thing that we just assume as a premise is that a lot of our issues are beyond human comprehension. Like, it doesn't matter how much of an expert you are. Like, if you sit down an expert and you want to interview them on a 600-page report that they themselves wrote, they probably can't recall with 100% fidelity all of the details that have been recorded, even just in that paper. So something that we recognize is that human beings, not only in their limited aperture and their cognitive biases, but also the limitations of their in real time performance and memory recall is just like a limitation, let alone like the expertise across so many different fields. For Diablo Canyon itself, being an expert in economics, like literally nuclear fission, the whole history of seismic risk in California. Like, there's so many different domains that you would have to be a deep understand and appreciate the debate most technical way, which the graph can accommodate. But people, I froze again. Sorry, I think I froze again. Okay, I'll stop talking. Anyway, things are complex, and it's really exciting that we're moving into an era where AI can really assist people in navigating knowledge and making good decisions. Artem.
Yeah, thank you for presentation, Jamie. I actually wanted to ask you about those muses.
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it? Like
Yep.
muses? Like, basically the agents that you built for Twitter, I believe. Like
Yeah.
what is happening? Like, are you happy with the progress? Like, maybe you can share some insights from that project.
Yeah, so the muses, so for people who aren't deep into library lore, because the Society Library is, digital library, muses are often depicted as reliefs in libraries. And so the muse of truth, the muse of research, a lot of the muses that we create characters around are often depicted in some of the most extravagant and exquisite libraries in the world. I have like collections of pictures of muses. So we decided to invent our own as we, one of our dear friends and volunteers who created the Eliza OS infrastructure, creates AI agents on Telegram, Discord, and X. Again, he's been a member of our team. He's volunteered for us for a really long time. He created this open source tech. So we decided to take our existing internal API tools, like our fact checker and our source retriever, because as the Society Library is building the ability to generate these graphs at the press of a button, we are doing it in a modularized way so we can actually partner with people. So someone can just say, hey, we just want to hit your fact checking API, or hey, we just want to grab sources, or hey, we just want to ground claims in quotes. People are able to hit the various APIs, and our APIs are talking to each other concordantly to build things out. So we just took some of our modulars APIs and connected them to open source agents. But like I said before, as soon as Grok 3 came out and was embedded as its own agent on X, we just dropped it. We're just like, and I think they also operate on Telegram. So we're just like, we're not going to compete with Grok on X. Like that's just very silly. So we're not going to waste the tokens. So we killed the project basically as soon as Grok 3 came out. But it's a really nice feather in our cap, because something that we find internally, and it's something we really respect about this community, is y'all publish a lot, and the Society Library never does. I don't think we've ever been mentioned in a scholarly article ever. We're just like the weird wonky builders who will stay up for like 48 hours and like hackathon over a weekend. Like that was kind of the Muse of Truth. The Muse of Truth was like a hackathon project. Our position predictor was like me and the guy who invented Eliza OS just like hacking at my house over the weekend. So we're like the hacker builder types. But it was a nice feather in our cap, because when we ship something and then a big company or a university comes out with a paper, comes out with a tool months after us, it's just like, okay, we're on the right track, right? Like we're never going to compete with Grok 3 on X. But the fact that we came out with a fact checking agent, source retrieving agent, intelligence agent months before Grok appeared, is like a nice feather. So it's something that we find generally like often. Microsoft recently came out with a video explaining like, hey, in order to actually like fact check a paragraph from an AI, you have to decompose it into all of its different like atomized parts, which is, an example that I showed you today. We took the paragraph, we extricated out all the premises, right? And I mean, we built the fine-tuned model to do that I think 2 years ago. So it's nice. So I would say in terms of progress, it's a feather in our cap. It gives us a clue that we're on the right track, that we're keeping a good pace, even if it's not like astonishingly popular, in part because we're a very small little outfit compared to like mega corporations and large universities with whom we are not affiliated. And so we moved on. The project's dead. Long story short.
You can get AI to write those papers if you actually do any commenting in your code at all.
I know, but it's like, it's so antithetical to us, right? To like write a paper is like it's so like we would need someone to write about us, because to write a paper, the structure of it is like, so it is meant to like, you just do this miniature literature review of like, this is the state of things. And we would just so over index on that. So it's just like, we're in a weird space. Like we've kind of gone beyond like paper as an acceptable format as an output from us, and are in graphland. So Benjamin Franklin once said, either do something worth the writing, or do the writing. And I think we're in the space of like, do something worth the writing. Mm-hmm.
Anne asks, what do law professors think of the mapping process?
I know that we've interacted with law professors in the past. It's been so long. I will say that, like, of the coterie of people who interact with the Society Library, I I mean, I guess the most impressive was like there was a gentleman who had won some of the major application there. And we were what did you all hear? Sorry about the.
You were out like 10 seconds.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. I'll just make it short. We haven't worked with a lot of law professors. So I don't know. There've been a few that we've talked to, but I hardly remember what they thought.
I ask because legal education is really changing with the advent of improved language processing. So it's changing in, the usual sort of some people hate it, some people love it ways. But you are starting to see things like people winning awards for legal aid, technical support tools. So there's a whole coterie of people who are building in those areas and building things that meet professional standards, which I think is interesting. So they're navigating that discourse between standards and building. And then I think some law professors are also sort of
We all lost Anne, right?
It's not just me. It's not just me.
Internet's not doing it today.
Oh no. Well, I will say, Anne, if you see this recording, or I'll follow up with you later, I would love that with that knowledge. I mean, again, some of our tooling is just out of the box. So like you could literally like put in case information. It could predict like the different stances and then the arguments, and it could actually retrieve and ground from legal materials, many of which are just available data sets that are just sitting around. I know the Harvard Law Library has a whole bunch of stuff. So I mean, the cool thing about the Society Library is like once you get it, it's just like we're trying to do this like fundamental foundational thing of inquiring into truth and optimality. And so whether it's a court case, whether it's policy, whether it's scenario planning, whether it's war, like whatever it is, it's like the level of rigor and comprehensiveness of inquiry is something that like could be fundamentally appreciated through so many use cases. And there can be slight adjustments like where you're retrieving information or like the slight shape and targeted the target of the inquiry in terms of like fields that you want to explore that are relevant, not relevant. But yeah, so maybe I should follow up with Anne. Hey, Anne. Welcome back. It would be great to figure out maybe our tooling out of the box would be of use to legal professors and lawyers and legal aids and that sort of thing.
Lil D, looks like you have a question in the chat. Would you like to give voice to it? Okay, maybe not. It'll probably be quicker if you, Jamie, just read it.
Sure. Little D. So when I was watching the breakdown of the one position, I was reminded of Samuel Beckett's story or play where there's a committee of 5 people who try to share a look, but each of the members keeps looking at someone who isn't looking back at them. The non-reciprocity of looks causes the simple action of sharing a look to break down into a drawn-out, laborious effort to meet each other's glance. What Beckett makes mysterious is how we regularly IRL share across non-reciprocity of practices, values, beliefs, etc. My open-ended question is, in the case study presented on Diablo Canyon, did you find points where, let's say, non-reciprocal positions didn't preclude sharing/consensus building in practice, or where the breakdown of logical premises did not conduce to action? Didn't preclude sharing. I mean, the point of the way in which we develop our ontology is to delineate logically coherent options for action. So when you have a whole mess of claims that are being made, it's actually a really important question of how do these relate to each other? And so the Society Library actually has a very specific ontology that is generated from what we call descriptive emergent structuring. So there's a lot of different platforms out there, and I've given talks about this before, about how the Society Library came to be, and we looked at 168 different systems before devising our methodology, our ontology, our standards, like our approach, everything. And even with Canonical Debate Labs, we broke down what are all the different assumptions of different platforms. So many platforms that do this type of mapping is incredibly prescriptive. They are deciding these are the constraints of the relationship between these things. And how the Society Library started was from first principles. We wanted to see, well, how do people argue? And then, like, how can we formalize that? And then we had this process of aggregating up and up. So boiling the ocean of claims and figuring out how they related. And what we discovered is that there's been a lot of like challenges of like infinite recursion and like all of this like bleeding out of debates when you're trying to map things that we solved for by doing something which we call descriptive emergent structuring, which means you are clustering claims based on logical relationship in a way that eventually points to some sort of orientation of action or decision that then suggests the question. The question in return determines what is logically coherent to argue about, which then delineates the possible validity of what can be argued. So you're actually arguing to conclusion. So it's like a really tricky thing to kind of get. And like I said, I've given whole talks about this. Let's talk about precluding sharing and consensus building. So the whole point of our ontology is to figure out, boil out, what are the general orientations, which are distinct from each other, and then the arguments, claims, and evidence that support why that is right or most optimal. Now, when it comes to sharing, I will say one thing is that a lot of these positions do share premises. They believe certain things as being true. However, those premises form different arguments, which have different conclusions, which support different orientations. So there is sharing, but the specific point of the Society Library is to be actionable, argue to conclusion. So the positions are incredibly nuanced and distinct. There's a very specific distinction between, thinking the plant should close now, or thinking the plant should close when its license runs out, or it should close unless it's no longer operated by PG&E, or it should remain open, but only if it becomes a desal plant, So we specifically delineate based on those differences, even if in general, a big group of people think it should be open, another group of people think it should be closed. There's subcomponents of that, which is what we call positions. So hopefully that answers your question. There's an infinite way that you can organize this data in its logical relationship, and we discovered a way to make it really neat, action oriented, and somehow seem to solve a lot of what's called good old fashioned AI problems of like debates being infinitely like recursive and bleeding out and losing relevance and like all sorts of messy data structure issues, which I would say is really kind of like our bread and butter IP, really, is like figuring that out, which we did manually, painstakingly by hand, analyzing lots of debates across different subjects like COVID and climate change and all this stuff. Yay, that makes a lot of sense. Yes, oh, I'm so glad. Great. Thanks for your question. It was a good one. Any other questions?
I can ask a question because I'm curious about if and where you've seen kind of limitations of like evidence-based logical reasoning come up, and where like sometimes really compelling non-logical arguments are like strong and held, and like especially maybe in like climate change and kind of working with like uh, indigenous communities, spiritual communities, like yeah, just things like that, and how those arguments are kind of interspersed in the structure and how they're considered.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I'm really glad you asked it, because this is also a common misconception of the Society Library. A lot of people walk around thinking that we're like obsessed with facts and evidence. But the thing that's really important to understand about like informal formal logic is that it has to do with claims. And claims could be things like, God told me that this is the right thing to do, because that's just an assertion, right? That's just a claim. So like whether it's a fact or an opinion, whether it's true or false, like you're in the land of logical like reasoning. And so basically anything that is effable can be included in the database. And so the Society Library's approach is that if you are sincere about being maximalist in context, if you are sincere about inquiring into truth, and if you are sincere about trying to map civilization scale reasoning, then you need to be as diverse and inclusive as possible. So like with Diablo Canyon, for example, there's indigenous arguments in that data set, a lot of indigenous considerations. And like when it comes down to making a decision, like whether, again, getting down to voting or weighting, it's a matter of civilization's decision about where to weight those things, right? Or whomever is making a decision based on the data. Our job is to collect all of it. So there was whole sections about indigenous people's preferences about what should happen to this nuclear power plant and why it should happen. And it's also why, I mentioned earlier, the Society Library, extracts from documents first, right? Like media and materials, because they tend to have high fidelity arguments, but we also engage directly with people as well. We got a grant. So we were talking with people who work at the the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We tried to talk to as many people as possible in diverse stakeholder groups, because there's a digital divide, right? Maybe indigenous elders have not written a blog post about this. Now, what we found was that, yes, there was petitions and writings and newspaper articles and that sort of thing, because people were really interested in conveying that story. But ultimately, there's a digital divide. Not everyone is sharing everything. So it's actually important to engage in communities, specifically marginalized communities, to make sure that their points of view are represented in the data set. And so, yeah, even though we model facts and, claims that are grounded in evidence and math and all that kind of stuff, people's moral reasoning, their preferences, their values, there's an entire category that we call ethics, where people are just arguing about like the ethics of this whole thing, which is all about like morality and whatever. Anything that can be put into language, can be made into an assertion or claim, can be entered into the debate itself, because it's an important aspect to consider. And then it's up to whomever is using the set, making decisions on the set, to determine how persuasive or compelling that is. Our job is to steelman it also as much as possible. It's something we did with a community in a city where there's a lot of activists. They were making their arguments. A lot of them were like moral arguments. And what did we do? We went through Supreme Court documentation and found Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissenting opinion, where she was strengthening that moral reasoning by adding her arguments. And then we connected those together. So a part of our goal with this collective intelligence effort is to make sure that we're fully harnessing all that is available for each one of these different points of view. There may be someone who feels really strongly but this is wrong, and then our job is to find where are all of the other arguments, all of the other evidence that could exist to support that. And in terms of standards, we do believe that is can justify ought. At least we're going to represent it that way. Philosophers can debate whether that's right or wrong, but we're definitely going to connect them. That is a part of our ontology, because we find that to be, again, descriptive and not prescriptive of how people actually argue. And so while we aim to formalize, we do include is justifying ought for people's consideration. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, I just have a quick follow-up question. So when you are steel manning like this, you still have to have a preference for some evidence over the others, because some things will have a preponderance of evidence for them, just some of it will be very bad. So how do you choose what to include, what to prefer, essentially?
Well, again, we're maximalist and we're contextualist, right? So here's the thing. So it's like if someone, and we've mapped this, right? In Diablo Canyon, for example, there's this whole argument about tritium in the data set, arguments about tritium leaking from Diablo Canyon and tritium causing childhood cancer, right? And so there's this scholar, I think in the UK, who published a whole bunch of studies about this. And then there's all these other scholars who are like, this guy's a crook. The data he's generating is false. And so all we do is map that debate, right? So it's like Diablo Canyon's leaking tritium and it's causing childhood cancer, according to this guy's research. And then we map, and everything gets little labels. So when things are highly contested, the node says contested on it. We've got I think 30 different labels just to flag people hey, you definitely want to unpack the next layer. The next layer is important to look at, right? And then you have 10 different scholars arguing why his data is BS, right? And then that guy has a rebuttal against, the 10 people who wrote a letter saying his data is BS, and you just map that out. So again, we are trying not to determine what is true. We are the earnest, humble epistemological inquirers, just trying to collect the the knowledge of our civilization, model it out in a clean, consolidated way, see you later, for people to make decisions on, or systems to make decisions on later. So we try to be maximalist, but what
Yeah,
we're
so
doing
how
is,
many, what percentage of nodes end up contested?
that's a good question. If I were to guess, to get the label means like it's like hotly contested. Maybe like if I were to guess, I hate guessing, 10 to 30% is like a hotly contested, like, hey, you really should look at this, you know? And I would say too, one of the reasons why it's so important to try to be maximalist is because we also have to recognize not only the limitation of human beings, but the limitations of observable knowledge. It's one of the reasons why I was in DC and advocating for more digitization and more retention in government, is that like no matter what we conclude from these giant graphs, the graphs are like, the map is not the territory. That's not actually reality. That is just the knowledge we happen to have collected. And so we should try to be maximalist as possible, because our aperture for reality for a complex issue is very limited. We are only human beings. And if we're interacting with reality through the proxy of like a knowledge graph, we want as much knowledge as possible, because sometimes what we've seen is even just one small claim makes a huge difference to a debate. And I've given talks about this too. 1.5 billion fish. It was a specific claim debated about in Diablo Canyon. Big deal. One little claim, it made a material difference. So we just try to be maximalist about it, and clean and consolidated, because we don't want a bunch of overwhelming junk, you know. So it's like deduplicate, you know, every time we find like the same claim being made, it gets packed up into one node. You're not seeing the same like thing. So it's just overwhelming with Gish Gallop, like someone's, reading of the graph. So yeah. I know we're at time, so I'm trying to like speed run everything I'm excited about talking about.
We can definitely continue the conversation in a thread in our Metagov Seminar channel, or talk about ways that, I don't know, maybe there's like some way that metagovernors can see into society libraries. If there are, I know you've said you've given other talks, or if you have like demos or ways that we can touch the tool, play, see, explore some of the graphs, that would be really cool. So,
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so I can follow up with you, or Liz can follow up with you. We'll figure that out. But for now, thank you so much,
Hey,
Jamie.
hey, don't end the call until she puts that use case file up.
Okay. 1 second. Okay.
Not let her get away. Meanwhile, we'll applaud her and all that.
All
Right?
right.
Applaud.
Run.
Here's some use cases.
Yeah, all right.
Practical applications. Woohoo.
Nice.
All right. Well, so you're gonna put a link in there?
I can put a link, yes. 1 second. Stop sharing. There you go.
And then I'll put it in the Slack.
This is my 5-minute talk. 5-minute talk.
Okay. All right, great.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks everyone for coming, and see you next week.
Sounds good. Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, Jamie. Bye-bye.